Okay, on to our last port of call, Japan. The main thing I remember learning about Japan back in the Triassic era when I attended high school was that American Naval Commander Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo, that is Tokyo Harbor, in 1853, pointed his guns at the Japanese shore, and forced a closed kingdom to open itself up to global trade and influence. This left me with the impression, which I really can't blame on my history teacher, that Japan had been entirely closed off before the American Navy sailed in. But that's a little hard to reconcile with emissaries showing up from all over Asia to celebrate the opening of Japan's enormous Todaiji Hall in 752. Or a Korean artist designing the Great Buddha. By the way, the highly symmetrical pagoda design of this temple shows its strong Chinese influence. Japanese architecture was traditionally more intimate. It was also more organic and asymmetrical, closely associated with natural surroundings. This was a building designed to show off, especially to the Tang Dynasty Chinese. This beautiful temple is not one of your required works, but I wanted you to see what is in many ways a more typically Japanese Buddhist temple complex. Phoenix Hall is probably the most famous temple to Pure Land Buddhism, a version of Buddhism that promises its followers salvation in a Western paradise if they follow the teachings of the Amitabha Buddha. It's not hard to see how the whole structure was designed to create an image of a celestial paradise. Two bronze phoenixes that decorate the ends of the ridgepoles and gave the temple its names were said to alight on kingdoms that were properly ruled. So here again we see Buddhism used by the imperial family to encourage unity and support for the regime. What did the phoenix symbolize in Chinese iconography? The Empress, or the Yin Force. Remember the weird 1998 work on the bottom? It's a vision of the Pure Land Paradise as well, complete with anime elves. Stay tuned for Unit 13. But note again that the Phoenix Temple is more asymmetrical and is related organically to its surroundings. This form of Japanese architecture would strongly influence American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Falling Water, seen here on the bottom right, will be one of our required works in the spring. But back to Japan. When the Tang Dynasty in China started disintegrating, Japan terminated relations with China in 894 and did enter into a period of isolation. The imperial court moved to Kyoto, and for almost 4 centuries, non-Buddhist Japanese art was mostly the art of a highly cultured, rather decadent imperial court. There are some really remarkable parallels to the French court at Versailles in the 17th and 18th centuries and its Rococo art. This era produced one of the most important works of Japanese, and for that matter, world literature, Tales of a Genji. It's full of intrigue, romance, seduction, and it was actually written by a Japanese noblewoman. This illustration comes from that book and is typical of Heian-era court painting. It's not a required work, and indeed we don't have any works from that era. Instead, our next required work comes from a period when this rarefied world fell apart. In the late 12th century, Japan disintegrated into civil war, and for the next 600 years it was ruled by a military ruler, the shogun, powerful lords, the daimyo, and their warrior elite, the samurai. During the first part of this military rule, Japan actually maintained close ties to the Asian world and even opened up to Jesuit missionaries and Portuguese and Dutch traders. In around 1600, however, the Tokugawa dynasty slammed the door shut, and it stayed shut until Commodore Perry forced it open in 1848. But we're getting ahead of our story. This work dates from the first period of warrior rule, the Kamakura period. The upper required image isn't much help, is it? That's because the work is almost 23 feet long. It tells the story of a relatively minor event in Japanese history, a brief armed skirmish between 2 competing factions for control of the capital, which at the time was still Kyoto. The hand scroll was painted 100 years after the events took place, and for what it's worth, the faction that won this battle lost out in the long run. Basically, as the scroll unrolls, one group of warriors surrounds the palace, captures the sovereign, places him in the cart, and then consigns the structure to the flames. Although this is not the scene that the College Board chose as a required image, it's probably the most iconic scene of the scroll. The palace on fire, the sky filled with swirling lines and bright colors, a little bit like Van Gogh. The website I've listed here lets you move through the entire scroll, from right to left, of course, with explanations. You can zoom in and out and focus on the details. It's a lot of fun, and of course, it's up on canvas. The night attack at Sanjo Palace is a very important example of what is called Yamato-e painting, a style of painting that was distinctively Japanese with much less Chinese influence. During the shogunate period, Yamato-e paintings mostly superseded the elegant courtly paintings of the earlier Heian period. They better suited the warrior culture that produced and admired these works. Do not try to write all this down now. I'm going to run through the scroll quickly and then come back to these elements of style with illustrations from the scroll. So, here's the Emperor's cart. Oops. And now the same cart is being surrounded by warriors. The scroll, like Trajan's column and like the Bayeux tapestry, uses the device of continuous narration to tell the complicated story of a battle. The repeated images, such as the cart, help us find where we are in the narrative and also give the painting a rhythmic pattern. Now we see the attackers approach the palace, the captured emperor in tow. They storm the palace. They set the palace on fire. The ladies of the court are crushed or burned. The battle continues outside the city walls. And finally, here's our required image. A lone archer escapes from the burning palace with an equestrian Japanese commander behind him. Now let's go back look at that laundry list of Yamato-e painting techniques and look for these features in our required work. Note that here that while the soldier is not carefully delineated, his armor and his weapons are, and this tells you something about what the patrons really cared about. This is another work that military historians love to study. And here are some of the other characteristics of Yamato-e painting. The bird's eye perspective, the bold colors and defined contours, heavy use of line, and the shallow spaces combined with the use of overlapping to create some sense of depth. Before I leave the samurai, let me just show you one more narrative painting. This one is a 6-panel scroll made of ink-painted silk. It shows the great battle that established the Tokugawa shogunate in around 1600. This was the military leadership that would once again close Japan off the world. The painting actually tells you one of the reasons that the Tokugawa clan won the battle. Any guesses? Maybe this close-up will help. Basically, the guys with those newfangled guns, which they purchased from the Portuguese, beat the samurai with swords. I'm going to break here. In my final lecture, I will return to Japan and explore more